I inherited my father's house and his pride and joy, a detached garage packed with tools and memories. The problem started the first night. Every time I stepped inside, I heard footsteps circling me, slow and heavy, even when I stood absolutely still, and even when I knew I was alone. At first I blamed pipes, wind, anything that made sense, until the lock reset itself, the lights clicked on by themselves, and the footsteps followed me out into the yard. In this first-person horror story, I uncover why my father walked laps in that garage every night, what he kept sealed under the concrete, and why silence is the most dangerous sound of all. Headphones recommended. Watch with the lights low. The first night after my father died, the footsteps started in the garage, and I told myself it was grief, because the brain does strange things when a house that used to breathe with someone else's routine suddenly falls quiet. He built that garage with his own hands in the late 80s behind a weathered two-story on the edge of a Midwestern town where trains still cut the night into long iron ribbons and where men of his generation measured worth by the tightness of a bolt and the truth of a level. I was the kid who could never find the right wrench, the one who thought college would save me from rust and winter and the small orbit of a two-lane life. When the lawyer slid the key across a polished table and said the house and the contents were mine, I pictured the living room and the creaking stairs and the front porch that had swallowed 1,000 cigarettes. Not the garage with its oil-dark floor and pegboard wall that had a shape cut out for every tool. I avoided it until the third night when the dishes in the sink felt like an accusation, and the refrigerator's hum sounded like someone whispering my name from another room. I took the key, the old brass one with the dimple filed into its neck, and crossed the yard in air that smelled like rain. The garage door was a man door, not a roll-up, and it stuck at the same place it always had. I shouldered it open and clicked on the lights, and the space snapped into hard focus, saw blades hung like silver moons, coffee cans of nails sorted by size, a chalk line coiled neat as a sleeping snake. I took one step onto the concrete. Another set of footsteps answered. They were not echoes. They were not drips from a roof. They were paced and heavy, and they circled to my left while I stood frozen with my hand on the switch, and when I turned, they shifted behind me without crossing the space between. I called out and instantly hated the thinness of my voice. No answer came, only a patient cadence like someone walking a measured lap around me with eyes on the floor and thoughts elsewhere. When I stepped back into the threshold, the footsteps stopped, as if the person had paused mid-stride to watch me decide. I shut the light and closed the door and did not lock it because my father always said, "Never lock a door if you plan to open it again soon." Morning makes cowards into skeptics. In daylight, with coffee in my hand and the neighbor's dog yelping 2 yards over the night sounded theatrical and stupid. Houses click. Squirrels fall through soffit vents. Concrete flexes. I walked back out with my phone as a recorder and set it on the workbench and forced myself to stay 10 full minutes while I moved nothing and touched nothing and stared at a vise that still had sawdust trapped in the threads like old bread. At 4 minutes, something happened that made the hair at the back of my neck rise. A screw rolled along the bench, bounced once, and fell. I did not see it move. I saw only its last inch of travel and the circle it left in powder. The recording caught the sound clean. It also caught faint steps, too regular to be random, too soft to be boots. I listened to it twice inside the house, and the walls felt closer the second time, and that was when I noticed the lock. I knew I had left the garage unlocked. The deadbolt was now thrown. I laughed like a person who knows laughter will keep the world boring if he insists hard enough. I told myself my hand must have turned the latch without registering the action, and I repeated the lie until it felt polite. My sister Claire drove in for the weekend, because grief creates errands like buying paper plates and coffee, and because there is comfort in saying the same childhood stories with the same punchlines when someone is missing from the table. She never liked the garage, even when we were kids, and Dad would call us out to hold a light or hand up a board, and she would invent a school project because the space made her feel like a guest in a room that belonged to rules that had never been explained. When I told her the footsteps story, she said what people say when they care about you more than they care about being right. She said sleep, take a walk, see a friend. On Sunday morning, she found me at the kitchen table with the old ledger from the garage open to a page where my father's handwriting had turned from straight carpenter's script into something slanted and impatient. He had recorded measurements and receipts for decades. On the last pages, the entries changed from part numbers to times. The list ran midnight, 12:14, 12:28, 12:41, 12:55, 1:10, each with a little tick mark as if he had paced and checked a clock and paced and checked again. In the margin, he had written a single sentence more than once. Do not let it rest. The town has men who know everything, and one of them owns the hardware store and knows about everybody's roof and mower and marriage. I walked there because shopping can be a way of asking a question you do not know how to form, and I bought a new deadbolt for the garage that I did not intend to install because buying it let me talk. I said I had moved back into my father's place, and the man's eyebrows did a small, respectful climb that said he remembered my father as the kind of man who could build a straight fence line without a transit. He said your old man was a night walker. He said it with a smirk, and then took it back with a shake of the head and said, No, I don't mean like that. I mean, the man walked the floor when the rest of us fell asleep, and more than once I came past it too and saw him in that garage with a radio low and a tape line on the concrete like he was wearing a path on purpose. He asked if I still had that old drill press, the one with the red belt cover, and when I said yes, he nodded like a doctor, hearing that the patient is still alive. I asked if he had ever heard anything strange over here, and he pretended not to understand and sold me a box of concrete anchors I had not asked for and told me the anchors were better than faith if you wanted something to stay put. I went back at dusk when the light through the high windows turned the dust into gold strips, and I rolled up my sleeves and moved everything off the central space and into a ring near the walls, and the ring looked ritual, even if it was only practical. The chalk line on the pegboard had an end clipped in like a talon, and I pulled it out and snapped a circle, then another inside the first, then a third because 3 has weight even for people who hate superstition. I set my phone to record and I walked the outer ring. The footsteps started on the first lap, not mine, lagging by 1/4 turn, keeping distance like a person embarrassed to walk too close. When I stopped, they stopped. When I stepped backward, the second set did not stumble. I felt stupid speaking into a room, but I said, I know you are there. And the old fluorescent light over the bench flickered once and settled. And in that small pause, the silence tightened into something that felt like attention. I said Dad wrote that he could not let it rest, and the second hand on the old clock over the door touched the 12 and stuck, and the room made a low sound like a truck passing from 3 streets away, and the air cooled 1 degree and then another, and then my breath fogged the strip of light from the window. I did not see a figure. I saw a shift the way you see heat over asphalt. The steps drew closer. I took 1 step toward the bench, and 2 sets of feet moved with me, and then there was a third set, softer, as if on wood, and I realized with a drop in my stomach that the third rhythm came from below. My father poured this slab thick because he had plans to anchor a lathe he never bought, and when I tapped the floor with a hammer, you could feel the difference in vibration between the center and the edges, and there, near the vise, there was a patch that sounded like a drum. The concrete was not hollow, it was layered. I moved the bench and found 4 round plugs where someone had patched bolt holes, and the patch was not his careful work. It was sloppy and shallow, and the color did not match. I chipped one with a cold chisel, and a ring of gray came away to reveal another circle of metal under the patch, like the lip of a can. I pried it up and found a recessed eye bolt, then another, a square, 4 points, exactly equidistant. In the ledger, I found an entry from 2 summers ago that said lift and a chain rental receipt and no project listed. The footsteps behind me paced once more and I let them happen, and instead of fearing the sound, I counted with it and found the rhythm that calmed the room the way heartbeats settle a crying child. I threaded the eye bolts and set the chain hoist to the rafters and felt the beam shrug under the load and swore I would not drop the roof on my own head. I pulled, and the square came up with a soft, wet sigh, as if something had sealed around it over years and the pit underneath breathed. It was not deep, just a box in concrete, 3 by 3 and maybe 4 feet down, and it was lined in boards that looked black because oil had soaked into the grain. On the bottom lay a rectangle wrapped in tarp and duct tape. The tape dried into pale scabs. The footsteps stopped. My thoughts shrank to the size of the box. I pictured anything you might bury, and the first thought was obvious and human, and I almost closed it, almost put the square back forever because graves do not ask to be opened. I pulled the tarp back in a series of ugly peels, and the smell that rose was not death. It was oily and metallic and electric. Inside lay a machine the size of a suitcase with 4 rounded corners and a vented top and a gleam that had survived time. It looked like a generator married to a speaker cabinet. A maker's plate on the side said Richter Field Resonator Model B with a date from 1959 and my father's initials scratched underneath with a carpenter's nail. A wire came off the back and disappeared into a conduit that ran through the concrete. I followed the conduit to the wall where a box with no cover held a switch that had not existed in my memory. Above it, written in pencil on the stud, were 2 words: "Keep walking." I did not switch it on because it was clearly already part of the room. You do not wake machines you do not understand. I read until midnight by a trouble light and found whispers of the name in old magazines stored in a milk crate under the bench. This thing was a field prototype meant to cancel vibration in factory floors. The copy promised silence, fewer accidents, workers less fatigued. The article mentioned side effects that sounded like fiction. Some men heard phantom steps after long shifts. Some reported dreams of someone behind them keeping pace. The company folded with no explanation. My father must have salvaged this from the old rail mill when it closed, and he must have believed in it enough to embed it in the garage. And then he must have learned the rule that his ledger implied: do not let it rest. The machine wanted motion. It wanted a metronome. It wanted a human pace to anchor the cancellation field that in turn kept something else from harmonizing with the structure. Silence would let the structure sing, and singing would let whatever pressed at the edges press through. When the first real night wind hit the eaves, the steps changed and learned the room the way a blind man learns a hallway. And I realized my father had taught them to expect a path. He had walked that circle every night, not out of madness, but out of duty. When I stopped, the steps tested the perimeter, and when I resumed, they settled and moved with me. And when I counted aloud at a pace, the room liked the temperature steadied and the light held steady, and the machine below made a faint sound like a cat purring in a beer can. I walked until my knees hurt and the clock said 2, and the old habit of being a child in this house returned and told me to put the tools away and sweep and lock up. And when I did, the lock clicked willingly and the deadbolt slid smooth, and I felt for the first time a partnership with the space. I slept 4 hours and dreamed of my father walking lips moving in numbers. The morning brought memory like postcards half burned. Men from the mill came to the funeral, and 2 of them, brothers with hands like shovels, told me from the steps that your old man kept something from cracking loose. That year they shut down Line 3. They said he had the touch with machines that would not play along with math. They said sometimes floors hum in old buildings, and if the hum finds a person, it will make music of them, and if it does not find a person, it will make a door. One of them did not meet my eyes when he said door. I should have asked more, but I did not want to be the son who chased myths in a town that would remember it every time a screen door slammed. I worked from home for a week, and at midnight I went out and walked because the ledger made it feel like a mortgage, and duty can be a warm coat even when you do not know if the wind is real. On the 5th night, the steps behind me multiplied again, and I realized there were 4 sets, mine and 3 that belonged to the room. To the slab, to the something below the slab that wanted the rhythm to be precise. I tried a metronome app on my phone and learned immediately that a machine beat was wrong. The air tightened and the light shuddered and the footsteps bunched as if confused. When I turned off the metronome and hummed my father's half-remembered tune, the space loosened. The tune was not a song. It was a sequence you count to cut a board, to drill a pattern, to place nails so boards do not split. I walked and hummed, and the field resonator settled into a steady thrumming that you felt in your teeth more than you heard with your ear. For a wild minute, I thought I had solved something. Then the footsteps followed me out. You carry patterns. The brain learns. The body obliges. On the seventh night, I locked the garage and went inside and boiled pasta and watched an old ball game and fell asleep on the couch. I woke at 2 to the sound of slow, measured steps above me on the second floor, and the floorboards did not creak in the random way of wood-crossing seasons. They counted. I stood with my heart knocking hard enough to make my vision narrow, and I listened, and the steps reached the top of the stairs and paused as if a person stood there with one hand on the rail and another on the wall, and then the steps continued down, hit the landing, descended, crossed the hall, and stopped in the doorway to the living room. The room did not change temperature. The air did not ripple. The footsteps were pure sound and intent. I said, "Dad," and the steps took one more pace and stopped in the center of the floor where my father had once oiled a baseball glove for me while telling me, "You do not force leather, you teach it." I said, "You can come in if this is you." And the house exhaled quietly as the heater kicked on, and then a voice I did not expect and will never forget said, "You are late." It was not my father's voice, and it was not human wrong. It was human almost. It was a mouth that remembered language, but used it like a tool, not like a birthright. It said again, "You are late." And behind the words, I could hear the cadence of the garage and the machine and something inside that field wanting more. And in that moment, I understood the worst part. The resonator did not just cancel vibration. It attracted it like a low-pressure storm front. It wanted a walker. When it had one, the world stayed flat. When it did not, it called one from wherever resonance waits. My father had walked to keep the door closed. When he died, the pattern kept trying to complete. I had become the missing metronome, and the pattern had learned the house and the yard, and now my sleep. Rules help even when they are guesses. I spoke calm and clear and said, "I will walk now," and the steps retreated up the hall like a person who has been offered a seat and goes to get their coat. I dressed and crossed the yard with the cold on my cheeks and the sky full of a moon so polished it looked like a clean wrench. I opened the garage and the footsteps were already inside, waiting near the circle in the chalk dust. I walked until 4 while the field purr vibrated its small approval, and then I did what fear had kept me from doing. I flipped the switch. The resonator grew louder but not in volume. It grew present. The hairs on my arms lifted and the chalk line trembled as if a drumhead skinned across the floor had been plucked. The footsteps doubled and then halved and then found me like fish find the anchor rope of a boat. The temperature dropped hard enough to make the light crack and flare, and in the center of the circle the air bent in a way you see only over asphalt in July, and a shape resolved with stubborn patience. A shoe touched the concrete in the way a first step claims a room, then another. The shape was a man-sized blur with shoulders that were not my father's, and hands that did not bother finishing themselves, and a head that turned toward me in a way that implied a face without offering one. It stepped, and the room stepped with it, and when it spoke again, the voice struck the center of my chest like a small hammer. "You are late," I said I did not know, and the blur found edges like frost finding a window and said, "You do now. Keep walking." I do not know how long I circled that night. Hours do not behave the same when your shadow counts for 2. I do know that when dawn made a gray ribbon along the bottom of the high windows, the blur unstitched and collapsed back into heat distortion and then into air, and the field purr faded like a car rolling away down a hill. The resonator clicked like a cooling stove. The footsteps, mine and theirs, slowed to a single pace, and then to silence. I shut the switch and closed the pit, and bolted the plate and lowered the bench back over the seam, and I leaned on it until my breath came like a person who has run too far in old boots. On the ledger, I wrote one line under my father's last entry: "I am here." Then I slept at the kitchen table with the kind of exhaustion that feels like debt paid, a story that asks you to believe it owes you something in return. I will give you what I can. I tried to remove the machine. I rented a heavier hoist and unbolted the eyelets and learned that the base had been keyed into the slab with pins that were not coming out without a jackhammer and a crew, and I felt an animal panic at the thought of destroying the very thing that had kept my nights from splitting open. I called a structural engineer who said it sounded like a vibration damper prototype and that if it still worked, I would be dumb to touch it. I read the patents and found lines of math that felt like spells. I talked to the Mill brothers again, and they told me a story about a foreman who stopped a humming beam by walking it until morning, and the foreman died the next year. But nobody in that bay lost a finger for the rest of the run. I started a new routine: work, eat, walk, sleep, repeat. Friends stopped asking me out, and I stopped telling them no, because it was easier to be the man who keeps a strange schedule than the man who explains a machine that eats silence. One night in late winter, when the air outside tasted like battery pennies, I missed the midnight start by 20 minutes because grief and duty both get lazy when you treat them like chores. I crossed the yard and found the door open and the light on, and the circle scuffed in an angry way that looked like a child had erased a figure with a sleeve. I stepped inside, and the footsteps were not in the room. They were in the rafters. They ran along the joists and dashed the length of the space back and forth like something testing the boundaries, and the resonator below had woken itself and was running a pulse that hurt my molars. I stepped into the circle, and the temperature shot down and the air tightened around my ribs. And the blur came fast this time, unspooling into the shape of a man who had chosen not to be a man anymore, because the work was simpler when you lost the features. He stepped toward me, and the floor shuddered like a thin bridge in wind, and I raised my hands without deciding to, and said, "I am here." And the shape stopped, with the relief of a man who has been holding back a heavy door alone, and someone finally takes the other handle. It spoke once more with words that had learned to be kind. "Keep walking." I do. The house stopped creaking in ways that set my skin on edge. The steps never go upstairs now. They wait for me where they belong. I do not run the resonator unless the air insists. I keep the pit closed and the bench heavy and the ledger open over the chalk dust. On some nights when the moon is thin and the town is all the way asleep, and the freight train on the far tracks sighs over the river, I feel another set of feet in the pattern, and it is not the blur, and it is not mine. It is slower and a little uneven the way a man walks when his back has known 1,000 lifts, and in that extra rhythm I hear the words without sound. Attaboy. On those nights I walk one extra lap for him, and one for the job, and one for whatever stands on the other side of the concrete when the world gets quiet and remembers how to sing. If you think the ending should be bigger, then you have never lived with small work that keeps the dark where it belongs. I moved back for good because the house knows my name again, and because the town feels honest when you let it be small. I teach shop now at the high school, and my hands have learned to prefer a tool that answers without software. On Saturdays, I change oil for neighbors who bring pie and stories, and we all pretend the garage is just a room where a man can fix a hinge if he pays attention. When someone asks why there is chalk on the floor, I tell them it keeps me honest with my steps. When someone asks why the door sometimes vibrates on windless nights, I say old hinges, wrong screws, cold metal. They nod because people like answers that take the teeth out of a question. At midnight I walk. I count in a voice that belongs to both of us now. The footsteps circle with me, steady and patient. When I stop too long, the air leans and the light threatens, and the field hum asks for payment in motion. When I move, the room relaxes. I do not know what happens if I stop forever, and I will not let you find out. My father left me a roof that whines a little, and a garage that wants a partner, and a job I understand better than the degrees I once pursued. The world out there can have its noise. In here, the steps never stop, and that is how we keep the door shut. I used to think haunting meant a thing that hates you. Sometimes it means a thing that needs you to keep the rhythm so nobody else hears what comes when the music ends.